Fact number 1. In the year 1247, on the marshy edge of medieval London, a small religious house was founded and named the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem. It was built by a nobleman called Simon Fitzmary, a sheriff of the city who had once been lost in a foreign land and who had prayed to the Star of Bethlehem for deliverance. When he returned home, he gave a strip of land outside the city wall, near Bishopsgate, to the Order of the Star of Bethlehem, a small crusading order from the Holy Land. The building was modest: a chapel, a few cells, a kitchen, a garden of herbs. For its first century, the priory sheltered pilgrims, collected alms, and cared for the poor.
Its original purpose was not the care of the mad. The mad came slowly, one by one, over many quiet decades, brought by family members who did not know what else to do with a brother who no longer slept, or a sister who heard voices in the rain. Records from the year 1330 show that 6 men were kept there as distracti, the Latin word for those whose minds had wandered away. So began the long, slow drift of a small chapel on the edge of London into the most famous madhouse in the history of the English language. It did not begin with cruelty. It began with a nobleman lost in a desert, a star on the horizon, and a prayer whispered into the dark.
Fact number 2. The word Bedlam is not a word that was invented. It is a word that eroded. Over the course of 3 centuries, the careful Latin name Bethlehem softened in the mouths of Londoners. Bethlem. Bedlam. Bedlam. By the 1500s, the word had slipped free of the hospital altogether and wandered into common speech, meaning any scene of uproar and confusion, any place where order had collapsed into noise. A Bedlam beggar was a wandering vagrant who claimed to be a former patient of the hospital and who carried a tin badge and a horn, begging for bread along the country roads. Shakespeare wrote of poor Tom o' Bedlam in King Lear. Ballads were sung about him in the taverns.
The name of a holy place, a place of the star and the silent chapel, became the name of disorder itself. It is a strange thing, how language carries the shadows of buildings long after the stones themselves have fallen. You can still hear the hospital in the word. You can still hear the wind through the old priory, whispering its new name. Fact number 3. For more than 400 years, Bethlem Hospital stood at Bishopsgate, just outside the old Roman wall of London. It was a small building, built of timber and stone, with a crooked roof and narrow windows. In the year 1569, a visitor described it as a place of stink and noise, with 30 cells, a long passage, and a small yard.
The inmates were chained to the walls. Their food was bread and
Beauty and decay, walking the same corridor, arm in arm. Fact number 4. From at least the 1600s until the year 1770, the public was permitted to enter Bethlem Hospital and look at the patients. For the small price of 1 penny on a Sunday, a visitor could pass through the iron gates, walk along the galleries, and peer into the cells. Wealthy Londoners brought their wives and children. Foreign travelers wrote about it in their journals as one of the sights of the city, along with St. Paul's Cathedral. and the Tower. A writer named Ned Ward, in the year 1703, described the visitors laughing at a naked man who had torn up his bedding.
Another visitor described how the patients would rush to the bars of their cells and beg for pennies or tobacco. Some patients played up for the crowd. Others crept back into the darkness of their rooms and turned their faces to the wall. The keepers collected the pennies at the gate. On a busy bank holiday, the hospital could earn more than £400 a year from these visits. It was, in the literal sense, a human zoo. And for the cost of a loaf of bread, any curious Londoner could walk among the cages. Fact number 5. In the year 1735, the English painter William Hogarth completed the final plate of his series called A Rake's Progress. The painting shows the bankrupt, syphilitic Tom Rakewell, the young hero of the story, now naked on the stone floor of Bethlem Hospital. His hands claw at the chains on his ankles. A keeper bends to fasten the iron. His grieving sweetheart weeps at his side. In the background, Hogarth painted other patients. A man who believes he is a king, wearing a crown made of straw. A tailor who draws mathematical diagrams on the wall with a piece of chalk, convinced he can calculate the longitude of the moon. A man who crouches and prays, thinking himself a bishop. And in the very back of the gallery, two well-dressed ladies in silk gowns stroll arm in arm, come to enjoy the afternoon's entertainment.
The painting was sold in the thousands as an engraving. It was the first time that a popular English artwork had pictured Bethlehem so honestly, and it burned the image of Bedlam into the imagination of the English-speaking world for the next 3 centuries. Fact number 6. The physicians of early Bethlehem were known as the keepers, and for generations, the post was held by the Monroe family. James Monroe took the post in 1728. His son John followed him in 1752. John's son Thomas followed in 1792. Thomas's son, Edward Thomas Monroe, followed in 1816. 4 generations of Monroes treated the mad of London for more than 125 years, a dynasty of mad doctors.
Their treatments were simple and brutal and rarely changed. They bled the patients with lancets. They blistered the skin with hot plasters. They purged the bowels with tartar emetic. They kept patients chained through the cold winter months, believing that physical suffering would drive out the evil humors of the mind. When Thomas Monroe was called before a parliamentary committee in 1815 and asked how he treated his patients, he replied simply that he bled them, he purged them, and he vomited them because his father had done so, and his grandfather before him. No one, he said, had ever asked him to consider any other way. Fact number 7.
In the year 1727, a woman named Alice Bourne was admitted to Bethlem Hospital after the death of her only child. She was 29 years old. Her husband had brought her to the gates in a hired carriage, weeping because she had stopped speaking and would not eat. The physicians chained her by the ankle to the wall of her cell. She remained there, with a few intervals of release, for the rest of her life. She died in the hospital in 1761, 34 years later. Her case is not unusual. It is only unusual that her name survives at all.
In the ledges of Bethlem are the names of thousands of men and women whose only sin was grief or poverty or a temperament that did not fit. A maid dismissed for arguing with her mistress. A sailor who had seen too many wrecks. A widow whose brothers wanted her dowry. Some stayed a week. Some stayed half a century. The walls did not distinguish between the truly ill and the merely inconvenient. The walls simply held whoever was brought to them.
Fact number 8. The food served at Bethlem Hospital was recorded in the year 1783 by a parliamentary inspection. Breakfast was a pint of gruel. Dinner on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays was 6 ounces of boiled beef with potatoes. On Sundays it was the same, with the addition of a small suet pudding. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, the patients received bread, cheese, and thin broth. The beer allowance was 1 quart per day for a man and 3 pints for a woman. When the inspector asked why the meals were so monotonous, the steward replied that variety excited the passions, and that a bland diet kept the mind still. Fresh vegetables were not provided. Fruit was never provided. In winter, the meat was often rotten. A physician recorded that between the years 1780 and 1800, many patients died of scurvy, not of the disease for which they had been admitted. We forget how often the mind is shaped by what the body receives.
A hungry soul, chained in a cold room, fed on boiled gruel and stale beer, cannot be expected to heal. The cure for many was simply to die. Fact number 9. In 1796, a young poet named James Tilly Matthews was admitted to Bethlem Hospital. He was a London tea broker who had traveled to revolutionary Paris and come home convinced that a group of French spies had built a machine, which he called the heirloom, that controlled his thoughts by means of invisible magnetic rays. He drew detailed diagrams of the machine, labeling every cog and valve and pipe of compressed gas.
Matthews is remembered today as the first person in the history of medicine whose paranoid delusions were recorded in full detail by a physician, in this case John Haslam, the apothecary of Bethlem. Haslam published the drawings in a book called Illustrations of Madness in 1810. The book is the earliest full case study in English psychiatric literature. The heirloom had levers, bellows, and an operator called Bill the King. Its purpose was to steal thoughts and transmit them to the French directory. Matthews believed this with absolute certainty, from the moment of his admission until his death in 1815.
He spent the last 19 years of his life in a cell, drawing diagrams by candlelight, listening for the hum of a machine that no one else could hear. Fact number 10. The old palace of Bedlam at Moorfields was finally abandoned in 1815. The building, which had once been called the most beautiful hospital in Europe, had sunk so deeply into the marsh that the floors slanted and the cells flooded in every rain. The patients were moved to a new hospital at St. George's Fields, south of the Thames, which still stands today as the Imperial War Museum.
When the old building was torn down, workmen uncovered in the cellars a great many iron rings, chains, and ankle cuffs, some of which had been in use for more than a century. They were sold for scrap. A bell from the chapel was sent to a church in Essex, where it still rings every Sunday. The 2 great stone figures of melancholy and raving madness, which had stood over the gate for 150 years, were saved and placed in the new hospital, where they still gaze out at the passing visitors, their mouths slightly parted, their blind stone eyes looking at nothing. A building can be torn down. The stones can be carted away.
But the sorrow that lived inside the walls has a way of staying behind, settling into the soil, drifting into the long memory of a city.
Fact number 11. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the standard treatment for a patient admitted to any European asylum was physical restraint by means of iron.
Ankle chains were riveted directly into the stone wall of the cell, measured so that the patient could reach a bucket for drinking water but could not reach the door. Wrist chains were shorter and held the hands across the lap. Some patients were also fitted with a neck collar of iron, connected by a short length of chain to a ring set into the floor, which prevented them from lying down. The chains were rarely removed. A patient might wear the same iron on the same ankle for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years.
The skin beneath would harden into a thick, pale ring of scar tissue. When a patient died, the keeper would come with a cold chisel and a hammer, knock the rivet free, and the body would be carried out through the back gate to the pauper's graveyard. The chain was not considered a punishment. It was considered a treatment, as necessary to the care of the mad as a splint was to the care of a broken leg. Madness, the physicians wrote, was a movement of the humors. Stillness, imposed by iron, was thought to be the cure. Fact number 12. The bedding of a typical 18th century asylum patient was a bundle of loose straw, strewn on the stone floor of the cell. In winter, a thin blanket of coarse wool was added. In summer, the straw alone. The straw was changed, in most institutions, once every 3 or 4 weeks, although in poorer asylums it was sometimes left for months, flattened and fouled beneath the sleeping body. A patient who wet the straw at night, or who was too ill to rise, was simply left on the damp bed. The smell of these cells, visitors recorded, was overpowering. One inspector who toured the York Asylum in 1814 wrote that he could not remain in the women's gallery for more than 10 minutes, even with a handkerchief pressed to his face. When fresh straw was brought in, the old straw was raked out into the yard and burned.
The patients, watching through the bars, could see the smoke rising over the high wall, could smell their own damp bedding on the air, and could hear the crackle of the flames that consumed their only rest. Fact number 13. Among the many theories of madness current in the 16th and 17th centuries was the doctrine that the mad could be cured by reducing the body to a state of starvation. The reasoning was that the mind was overheated by an excess of blood, spirits, and rich food, and that if the body were weakened, the excess would drain away.
A physician in Padua in 1623 recommended that his patients be fed only thin bread and water for 40 days, like the fasting of our Lord in the wilderness. The patients so treated grew thin, pale, and listless. Their hair fell out. Their gums bled. Many could no longer stand. The physicians interpreted this collapse as evidence that the humors were leaving the body. When the patient finally died, the cause of death was recorded as exhaustion, not starvation. It is a hard thing to say how many minds were lost to the cure of starvation. It was, in its way, the logical conclusion of a theory that saw madness as an overflow. If too much had gone in, the answer was to let nothing in at all.
The answer, of course, was always wrong. Fact number 14. The cold bath was considered for nearly 300 years the single most reliable treatment for madness. In its simplest form, the patient was stripped, bound, and lowered by ropes and pulleys into a stone tank filled with freezing water and held there for several minutes. A physician named Jean Colombier, writing in the year 1785, recommended a duration of 2 minutes for a mild case and up to 10 minutes for a raving patient. The shock to the system was extreme. The patient gasped, struggled, sometimes fainted. The heart slowed. The lips turned blue. A keeper stood by with a rope, ready to haul the patient out.
The idea was that the cold would constrict the blood vessels of the brain and squeeze out the madness like water from a sponge. Some patients died of the treatment, their hearts stopping in the first minute. Others were said to have emerged quiet and docile, which was considered a sign of cure. More likely, they had simply entered the numb, exhausted stupor of hypothermia. But in an age that valued quietness above all else, any silence looked like success. Fact number 15. A peculiarly medieval and early modern treatment for madness was the whipping of the patient, in the belief that the strokes of the lash could drive out a demon.
The patient was tied to a post in the courtyard, stripped to the waist, and struck with a leather scourge or a bundle of birch rods. The priest, if one were present, would recite the rite of exorcism in Latin. The keeper would count the strokes. In the year 1568, a woman named Margaret Flower at a Flemish asylum was whipped 40 times in a single session after she claimed to hear the voice of the Virgin in her cell. She was then locked in a dark room for 3 days. When she was released, she no longer spoke at all. Her silence was recorded in the hospital log as a cure. It is a terrible arithmetic.
A voice heard where there was no voice, silenced by 40 strokes of the rod. The demons, the physicians wrote, had fled. Perhaps they had. Perhaps what had fled was only the last thin thread connecting a frightened woman to the world of the living. Fact number 16. Most early asylums did not heat their cells. Stoves were considered dangerous, and fireplaces required chimneys that the patients might climb. In London, Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, the winter nights in the galleries fell well below freezing. Water froze in the tin cups. Breath hung like smoke in the lantern light. Patients wrapped themselves in whatever straw or blanket they could find and tried to sleep, shivering, sometimes huddled against another patient for warmth.
A physician at the Vienna Narrenturm in 1798 recorded that in the months of January and February, the mortality rate among his patients doubled. The cause of death was most often recorded as fever, but a modern reader can see clearly what it was. They froze, slowly, in the dark. They froze. And in the morning, the keepers would open the cells and remove the ones who had not stirred, and fresh straw would be brought, and the cold would settle again into the stones of the wall, waiting for the next long night. Fact number 17. An old treatment, used well into the 1800s, was the swinging chair.
The patient was strapped into a chair which hung by ropes from the ceiling of a tall room, and was then spun in a circle by an attendant. The purpose was to make the patient violently dizzy and sick, on the theory that the vomiting and disorientation would break the pattern of disordered thought. Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles, recommended the swinging chair in his medical writings, as did the influential Scottish physician William Cullen. The chair was spun for as long as half an hour at a time. A patient who emerged pale, retching, and unable to stand was considered to have been successfully treated. The theory was wrong, but the effect was real. A terrified, nauseated patient is a quiet patient.
Quiet, in those asylums, was always read as progress. And so for decade after decade the chairs spun, the ropes creaked, and the mad were made dizzier than they had ever been. Fact number 18. The typical asylum cell of the 1700s measured about 8 feet by 6 feet. It had a stone floor, stone walls, a small grated window high up near the ceiling, and a heavy wooden door with an iron grate at eye level. Inside were a straw pallet, a tin cup, and a wooden bucket for waste. Nothing else. No chair. No table. No book. No picture. No warmth of any kind. Some cells had a ring in the floor for chains. Some had a ring in the wall. Some had both.
The patient, once admitted, might remain in this small bare room for the rest of his life, seeing the sky only through the small high window, hearing the distant voices of other patients through the thick walls, and marking the passing of time by the single stripe of sunlight that crossed the floor each afternoon. The mind, deprived of all objects and stimulation, does not grow calm. It feeds on itself. It conjures its own companions, its own voices, its own world. In trying to cure madness by emptying the room, the asylums often created the very thing they claimed to heal. Fact number 19. The physician Philippe Pinel, working in Paris in the 1780s, kept careful records of the diets fed to asylum patients across Europe.
He found that in most institutions, the meat ration was less than 3 ounces per day, the bread ration was 8 ounces, and fresh vegetables appeared only in the summer. He calculated that a patient was receiving fewer than 1,200 calories per day, at a time when a working man was thought to require at least 3,000. Pinel observed that the patients grew weak, their teeth loosened, their wounds would not heal, and their minds sank deeper into apathy and confusion. He suspected correctly that much of what passed for incurable madness was in fact the mental collapse of slow starvation.
When he increased the rations at the Bicêtre hospital in 1793, he recorded that many patients whom other doctors had declared hopeless began to recover within 6 weeks. Before the mind can heal, the body must be fed. It is a principle older than medicine itself. But in the long corridors of the 18th century, it had been forgotten for a very long time. Fact number 20. In the late 1700s, a Scottish physician named Alexander Crichton wrote that every asylum he had ever visited had a distinct smell, which he called the asylum odor.
It was, he wrote, a mixture of stale straw, unwashed bodies, human waste, boiled cabbage, damp stone, and lamp smoke, and it clung to the clothes of a visitor for many hours after he had left the building. He claimed that he could identify an asylum worker on the street by the scent alone. The keepers, the physicians, the cooks, the night watchmen, all carried it home in the folds of their coats. Their children could smell it on them at the supper table. Their wives refused to wash their uniforms with the family linen. It was the scent of a world set apart, a world that the city pretended did not exist, a world that nevertheless rode home every night in the threads of a coat.
A building, the old saying goes, is what happens inside it. And for so many centuries, what happened inside these buildings was a slow, patient forgetting, a hush so complete that even the smell of it could not be washed out. Fact number 21. On the morning of the 25th of August, 1793, at the height of the French Revolution, a newly appointed physician named Philippe Pinel walked into the yard of the Bicêtre hospital south of Paris, carrying a ring of iron keys. He had been appointed chief physician by the revolutionary government, and he had asked for permission to try something that had not been tried before. He had asked to remove the chains. Pinel was 48 years old, a mild man, soft-spoken, with a long, thin face and gentle eyes. He was accompanied by the hospital governor, a former soldier named Jean-Baptiste Poussin, who had himself been a patient many years earlier and had risen to become the warden. Together they walked down the long stone corridor of the men's ward, unlocking the shackles of one patient after another. The first man they unchained had been in irons for 40 years. He stepped unsteadily into the courtyard, looked at the sky, and wept. The scene, later painted by Tony Robert Fleury, became one of the founding images of modern psychiatry. A man looking at the sky after 4 decades in iron. It is a small thing, and it is everything. Fact number 22. Philippe Pinel did not invent the idea of kindness to the mad. He borrowed it, in part from his friend and mentor, Jean-Baptiste Poussin, who had already been quietly reforming the Bicêtre wards for years before Pinel arrived.
Poussin, the former patient turned warden, had personally supervised the careful removal of the chains from the most violent inmates, replacing them with leather restraints that could be loosened at any time. He had forbidden the keepers to strike the patients. He had ordered clean linen and warm soup. When Pinel arrived and saw what Poussin had done, he recognized a kind of practical wisdom he himself did not possess. He worked with Poussin for nearly a decade, learning from him, writing down his methods, and eventually bringing him along when Pinel was promoted to the Women's Hospital at the Salpêtrière in 1795. History has remembered Pinel as the father of modern psychiatry. History has mostly forgotten Poussin.
But it was Poussin who taught Pinel that a kind word, a bowl of broth, and a loosened strap were often more powerful than all the bleedings and purges of the old medicine. Fact number 23. Pinel's great contribution was not a new treatment. It was a new way of seeing. In 1798, he published a book called The Treatise on Insanity, in which he argued in calm, careful prose that the mad were not possessed by demons, not criminals, not animals, not unreasonable. They were sick. They were suffering from a disease of the nervous system, and they could be treated with the same patience, respect, and care that one would give to a man with pneumonia. This seems, from our distance, an obvious claim.
But in the Europe of 1798, it was radical, almost heretical. The old view, held by the Church and by most physicians, was that madness was a moral failure, a punishment, a sign of hidden sin. Pinel's quiet sentences cut the cord that had tied mental illness to moral judgment for 2,000 years. Diseases of the body had long been met with medicine. Diseases of the mind, he insisted, deserved no less. The distinction once made could not be unmade. It is the distinction on which every modern hospital for mental illness still rests. Fact number 24. Pinel called his new method the traitement moral, the moral treatment. By moral, he did not mean ethical in the sense of right and wrong. He meant the treatment of the morale, the spirit, the inner life of the patient. The method had 4 simple principles. Remove the chains. Speak to the patient as to a reasonable person. Provide useful work in the gardens or workshops. And observe the patient's history in detail so that each individual might be understood. Under this regime, patients at the Bicêtre and the Salpêtrière were given light labor in the laundries and kitchens. They were allowed to walk in the gardens. They were served regular meals. They were spoken to by name. Many, whom the old medicine had declared incurable, recovered. Pinel recorded that in 1800, more than 200 patients were discharged from the Salpêtrière as restored to reason. The reforms were not perfect.
They were still, in many ways, harsh by modern standards. But they introduced into the long, dark corridor of madhouse history a new light, faint at first, growing stronger, the light of the simple proposition that a person in pain deserves a human voice. Fact number 25. At the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, where Pinel took charge of the women's wards in 1795, he found nearly 4,000 inmates. It was the largest asylum in the world at that time, a small city of the lost. There were wards for the elderly, for the epileptic, for the incurable, and for the criminally insane.
Pinel walked through each ward, notebook in hand, asking each woman her name, her age, her history, the moment at which her mind had changed. He found among them peasants who had lost their farms in the Revolution, noblewomen whose families had been guillotined, prostitutes cast out in middle age, servants dismissed without character, widows whose sons had died in the wars. He found, in short, that madness was very often the last address of grief. It was the name given to sorrow when sorrow had nowhere else to go. This insight, plain in his notebooks, runs quietly beneath all of modern psychiatry. A broken mind is often a broken life, and the cure, if there is one, begins with listening to how the breaking happened. Fact number 26.
Among the first patients freed from his chains at the Bicêtre was a former English soldier, known only as Devereux, who had been in irons for 12 years. When Pinel approached him, Devereux warned him that he would tear him to pieces. Pinel, unarmed and alone, sat down on a stool just outside the cell and spoke with him for more than an hour, gently, about his service in the army, about the English coast, about his mother. At the end of the hour, Pinel turned to Poussin, and the keys were brought. Devereux was unchained. He stood, stretched, took a few careful steps, and then, according to Poussin's report, fell upon his knees and kissed Pinel's hand.
Within 6 months, he had become one of the most trusted attendants in the hospital, assisting in the care of the other men. He died at the Bicêtre in 1809, a free man in a bed with clean sheets. A chain is not only iron. Sometimes it is the belief that a man can never change. Both can be unlocked if someone is willing to sit down on a stool and talk for an hour. Fact number 27. The moral treatment, as developed by Pinel and Poussin, required a new kind of asylum architecture. The old prison-like buildings, with their dark cells and iron grates, were unsuited to a method that prized open air, light, and gentle labor.
Pinel wrote papers recommending that future asylums be built on high ground with large windows, with gardens and workshops and walks between trees. He drew sketches of what a healing institution should look like. Many of them were never built. Some were. In the decades after his death in 1826, new asylums across France, Britain, and the United States began to incorporate his ideas. The York Retreat in England, the Frankfurt Asylum in Germany, the Hartford Retreat in America, all borrowed Pinel's designs. Gardens replaced courtyards. Chapels replaced punishment rooms. Windows grew larger. The building itself, Pinel believed, was part of the medicine. A sick mind placed in a dark stone cell could only grow sicker.
The same mind placed in a sunlit room
looking out on a garden, might begin the slow, uncertain work of returning to itself. Fact number 28. Pinel's reforms spread slowly, not because his ideas were resisted, but because the practical costs of kindness are often higher than the costs of cruelty. A chained patient requires only iron. A patient freed by moral treatment requires attendants to speak with him, gardens for him to walk in, workshops in which to place a tool in his hand. The old cruelty was cheap. The new kindness was expensive. Many of the asylums that adopted Pinel's language did not adopt his methods. They removed the chains, hung his portrait in the entrance hall, and left everything else unchanged.
The warden still struck the patients. The food was still thin. The rooms were still cold. Only the visible iron was gone. It is one of the harder truths of reform. Ideas are easy to import. The slow daily patience they require is the real work. And that work, as Pinel himself understood, must be renewed every morning in every ward with every patient, for as long as the hospital stands. Fact number 29. Philippe Pinel died in Paris on the 25th of October, 1826, at the age of 81. He had been chief physician of the Salpêtrière for 31 years. He was buried in the cemetery of Père Lachaise, beneath a simple stone.
His students, many of whom had become the leading alienists of France, carried the coffin. Two former patients, whom he had known for decades, walked behind it. On his desk at the time of his death was a half-written page, the beginning of a new edition of the Treatise on Insanity. The final sentence, left incomplete, began with the words, "It remains to consider, with the greatest attention, the condition of those whom the world has forgotten, and whose voices." The sentence broke off there. Whose voice is what? We will never know. Perhaps only that they still deserve to be heard. Perhaps that the work of listening is never complete, only handed on from one gentle listener to the next. Fact number 30.
In the long view, Pinel's most important contribution was the simple idea that the mad are people, that madness is a disease, and that a disease can at least sometimes be eased. This was not a cure. He cured very few. But he changed what the question was. Before him, the question had been, how do we contain these dangerous creatures? After him, the question became, how do we help these suffering people? That single shift in the question has carried forward through 230 years. Every psychiatric hospital, every clinic, every whispered conversation between a doctor and a frightened patient owes a debt, faint but real, to the quiet morning at the Bicêtre, when a set of iron keys was turned in a set of iron locks.
We inherit many things from the dead. Sometimes we inherit a cruelty we must undo. Sometimes, if we are fortunate, we inherit a kindness we must keep.
Fact number 31. In the year 1796, in the English city of York, a small group of Quakers opened an institution they called the Retreat. It was built on a low hill outside the city, in the middle of a walled garden, with only 30 patients at first. Its founder was a tea merchant named William Touquet, who had been horrified by the conditions at the York Asylum after a fellow Quaker named Hannah Mills had died there under unclear circumstances. Touquet had no medical training. He had only, he said, a conviction that the mad were children of the same God, and that they deserved to be treated as such. The retreat had no chains, no whips, no cold baths, no swinging chairs.
Its patients were served fresh bread and tea at small tables. They walked in the garden. They worked in the workshops. They attended Quaker meetings in a quiet room with white walls and wooden benches. Within a decade, the retreat was famous across Europe. Visitors came to see for themselves whether such a thing could really work. It could.
Every patient was to be addressed by name. No attendant was to raise his voice. The patients were to be considered, in the language of the founding document, as our brothers and sisters, temporarily visited by affliction. This respect was enforced by a simple daily practice. The patients and the attendants ate at the same tables, at the same times, eating the same food. The patients drank the same tea from the same pot. The attendants were not servants of the patients, but companions. It was an idea far ahead of its time, and it was put into practice by people who had never read a medical book in their lives.
Sometimes the cure for a great cruelty is not a new theory, but an old kindness, remembered by the hands that pour the tea. Fact number 33. During the Victorian era, a diagnosis frequently applied to women was hysteria, from the Greek word for womb. The theory, dating back to Hippocrates, was that the uterus could wander through a woman's body, causing shortness of breath, fainting, headaches, weeping, and 1,000 other complaints. By the 19th century, the anatomy had been corrected, but the word and the concept remained. A woman who was too emotional, too quiet, too angry, too sexual, too unsexual, or simply too much might be diagnosed with hysteria.
The cure, depending on the physician, might be marriage or rest or cold water or seclusion, or by the late 1800s, confinement in an asylum. Thousands of women were admitted under this diagnosis in Britain alone. The Victorian Asylum Register lists many such cases. A young wife in Manchester, admitted for reading novels until late at night. A schoolmistress in Leeds, admitted for writing too many letters. A widow in Exeter, admitted for refusing to remarry. The walls of the asylum we see now were often the final shape of a society's discomfort with the inner life of women. Fact number 34.
Under English law, through most of the 19th century, a husband had the legal right to have his wife committed to a lunatic asylum on his sole authority, provided he could find a physician to sign the papers. The woman herself had no right to appeal and no right to refuse. Once admitted, she had no right to leave without her husband's consent, even if her doctors judged her recovered. In 1851, a case in London brought the practice briefly to public attention. A wealthy woman named Rosina Bulwer-Lytton, the wife of the novelist Edward Bulwer-Lytton, was committed to a private asylum after she appeared at his political rally and called him a scoundrel.
She was released only after her supporters raised a public outcry in the newspapers. Most women had no such supporters and were not released. How many women were held, for how many years, in the quiet private asylums of England? The records are incomplete. The gravestones in the asylum cemeteries, small and unmarked,
are easier to count than the names. Fact number 35. The Victorian asylum was typically a vast building set in extensive grounds, often resembling a country estate or a great public school. Its corridors could run for a quarter of a mile. Its chapel could seat 500. Its farm grew most of its own food.
In 1854, the Colney Hatch Asylum north of London held 2,200 patients, making it the largest such institution in Europe. The architecture was designed to convey order, authority, and moral improvement. Long, straight corridors, symmetrical wings, ornamental clocks, neat flower beds. A visiting royal personage taken on a tour might leave with the impression that the mad of England were being housed in a palace. He would not see the back wards, the locked galleries, the epileptic ward, or the wing for the incurables. Beneath every beautiful building there is always another, smaller, hidden building. In the Victorian asylum, the hidden building was the one where no one took visitors. Fact number 36.
Among the commonest reasons for admission to Victorian asylums, as recorded in the casebooks, were novel reading, religious excitement, disappointment in love, overwork, masturbation, childbirth, the menopause, and the death of a close relative. Many patients were admitted simply as weak-minded or feeble without any specific symptom. Some were admitted for being deaf, some for being left-handed, some for being, in the phrase of the time, peculiar. The threshold for admission was, in short, very low, and the longer one looked at the records, the harder it became to distinguish madness from sadness, loneliness, poverty, or simply unfashionable behavior. Many of the patients locked in these institutions for decades were, by any modern measure, not ill at all.
The asylum in the 19th century served a function that the 19th century did not like to name. It was the place where lives that had become impossible were quietly placed, out of the way, behind tall walls and neatly clipped hedges. Fact number 37. The Victorians were great believers in work as a cure. Every large asylum of the period had farms, workshops, gardens, laundries, and kitchens in which the patients labored, sometimes for many hours a day. The products of their work were used within the hospital, and the surplus was sold to the surrounding community. A well-run asylum was nearly self-supporting, its bread baked by the bakers who had come in mad, its boots made by cobblers whose wits were said to be wandering.
This work was called therapeutic, and in moderation it probably was. A patient given a task, a schedule, and a result grew calmer than one left alone in a cell. But the line between therapy and labor was thin, and in many asylums, the patients worked the long hours of an industrial workhouse, producing goods for the profit of the trustees. The same activity, repeated with love, is medicine. Repeated with exploitation, it is drudgery. The asylum was often both at once, on different sides of the same long stone wall. Fact number 38. In the year 1845, the British Parliament passed the Lunacy Act, which required every county in England to build and maintain a public asylum for its pauper lunatics. The law was intended to rescue the mad from the private madhouses, where abuses had long been reported, and to place them under public inspection. It worked in part. A new system of commissioners in lunacy was created, inspections became regular, and the worst of the private horrors slowly ended. But the law also triggered an enormous building boom. In the 50 years that followed, England constructed more than 100 county asylums, each larger than the last. The asylum population grew from about 8,000 in 1845 to more than 100,000 by 1900. The system, built to protect the mad, also collected them in numbers never before seen. Every good law has an unintended afterlife.
The law that set the mad free from private cruelty also gathered them unprecedentedly into the quiet custody of the state. Fact number 39. A remarkable document survives from the year 1870, the private diary of a nurse named Emma Riches, who worked at the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum in Berkshire. She wrote in a small black notebook in the evenings after her shift. She recorded what the patients said, what they ate, how they slept. She wrote about a man who believed he was the lost son of Queen Victoria, and about a woman who sang old Welsh hymns at 3 in the morning. The diary was discovered in an attic in 1998, wrapped in brown paper.
It is one of the very few surviving first-person accounts of daily life in a Victorian asylum by someone on the staff side, and it is remarkable for its tenderness. Emma Riches did not see monsters. She saw tired, confused, frightened people who reminded her. She wrote of her own grandmother toward the end. Somewhere behind every asylum door there was, occasionally, a quiet witness like Emma, who saw clearly what others did not. Most of them did not keep diaries. Most of what they saw, we will never know. Fact number 40. By the year 1890, the Victorian Asylum had reached its peak. The great buildings stood at the edges of cities from Glasgow to Plymouth, from Dublin to Toronto, from Melbourne to Cape Town.
Each one a small town, each one with its own brass band, its own newspaper, its own chapel, its own cemetery, each one holding between 1,000 and 3,000 souls, and quietly adding a few more every week. From a distance, at dusk, the great Victorian Asylum looked almost beautiful. Rows of lighted windows against the darkening sky, a clock tower striking the hour, smoke rising from 100 chimneys. It was the Victorian faith in architecture made visible, the belief that the right building, in the right place, could cure almost any human ill. That faith was mostly wrong.
But it built for a while some of the largest, strangest, loneliest houses that the human race has ever raised, and filled them with the people that history had not yet learned how to love.
Fact number 41. On a cold Sunday morning in March 1841, a 39-year-old Boston schoolteacher named Dorothea Dix went to the East Cambridge jail to teach a Sunday school class to the women prisoners. What she saw there changed the rest of her life. In a cold, unheated cell, behind the criminals, she found several women who had committed no crime. They were insane. They had been placed with the prisoners because there was nowhere else to put them. Dix asked the jailer why there was no stove. He answered that the mad could not feel the cold. She asked why the cell was not clean. He answered that the mad could not know the difference.
She returned home that evening and wrote a letter. Within a year, she had begun a personal campaign that would take her, unaccompanied, into every almshouse, jail, and asylum in the state of Massachusetts, and then into every state east of the Mississippi. The mad Dorothea Dix was certain, could feel the cold, and she would spend the next 40 years telling the legislatures of the world exactly so. Fact number 42. Over the course of the 1840s, Dorothea Dix traveled more than 10,000 miles through the American states, quietly, alone,
visiting almshouses, workhouses, and county jails. She carried a small notebook, and in it she recorded what she saw. A woman in a cellar in Groton, chained to the wall.
A man in Newburyport, in an iron cage in a barn. A woman in Medford, locked in a closet for 17 years. In January 1843, she presented her findings to the Massachusetts legislature in a document known as the Memorial. It was a plain catalog of what she had seen, written in a restrained, factual voice. "I tell what I have seen," she wrote. "Insane persons, confined within this commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." The legislature, which had expected a few gentle suggestions, sat in silence. Within 6 months, the state had appropriated funds to expand the Worcester State Hospital. Dix had begun her long march, and the march would not stop for 40 years.
Fact number 43. Dorothea Dix was, in her outward manner, the quietest of reformers. She was a small woman, slight, with neat brown hair and large, serious eyes. She spoke in a low voice. She never raised her arms in speech. She wore plain gray dresses. She avoided public platforms. Nearly all of her work was done through private letters, private visits to legislators, and the slow gathering of facts. She did not march. She wrote. Yet by the time of her death in 1887, she had been instrumental in the founding or expansion of more than 30 state mental hospitals in the United States, and had extended her work to Canada, Scotland, England, France, Italy, and Russia.
Pope Pius IX received her in private audience and agreed to reform the asylums of the Papal States. Tsar Alexander II ordered reforms in the Russian hospitals on her recommendation. Few Victorians, male or female, had such a reach. She did it all in a gray dress, in a low voice, walking with a small notebook through one damp almshouse after another. Fact number 44. In 1848, Dix proposed to the United States Congress a bill that would have set aside 10 million acres of federal land, the sale of which would fund the care of the indigent insane across the entire country. The bill passed both the House and the Senate after 6 years of her lobbying.
President Franklin Pierce vetoed it in 1854, arguing that the federal government had no constitutional authority to involve itself in the welfare of the mentally ill. The veto was a devastating blow. Dix had given 6 years of her life to the bill. She was exhausted. Her health collapsed for the first time. She left America for 3 years of recuperation in Europe, continuing her work in every country she visited. But the American system of mental health care, which might have been nationalized in 1854, remained state by state, county by county, underfunded, uneven, and fragmented. It remains so today. One presidential pen, one veto, a century and a half of consequences.
History is a long corridor, and the echoes of small decisions never quite stop sounding. Fact number 45. During the American Civil War, Dorothea Dix put aside the cause of the insane to serve as superintendent of Army nurses for the Union. She was appointed in April 1861. She was 59 years old, and she had no training as a nurse. What she had was the one thing the war most desperately needed, an administrator who could not be moved by anything except the suffering in front of her. She organized more than 3,000 nurses for the Union armies. She fought the army doctors for cleaner wards, for adequate bandages,
for separate wings for contagious cases.
She was unpopular among her superiors, who found her stubborn and unyielding. But she was loved by the wounded soldiers who woke in the field hospitals and found at the foot of the cot a small gray woman checking the pulse. When the war ended, she quietly returned to her former work. There were still almshouses to visit. There were still cold cellars. There were still minds, she wrote, that needed to be reminded they were loved. Fact number 46. The great public asylums built in the United States in the second half of the 19th century were designed largely according to a plan promoted by Thomas Story Kirkbride, a Philadelphia physician who believed that the building itself was a form of therapy.
The Kirkbride plan called for a long central administrative building, flanked by two wings of staggered wards, like the outstretched wings of a bird. Each ward held no more than 250 patients. Each room had a window. Each corridor opened onto a garden. Between 1850 and 1890, more than 70 Kirkbride hospitals were built across the United States. From the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey to the Oregon State Hospital in Salem. Their great brick buildings with their central towers and long wings dominated the landscape of whatever town they stood in. Many still stand today. Some have become museums. Some have become apartment buildings. Some have simply been left to the trees and the owls. Kirkbride believed that beauty was medicine.
He was partly right. A beautiful building does not cure a mind, but it can, on a long, slow afternoon, remind the mind that it is loved enough to be housed in beauty. That reminder sometimes is enough to begin the healing. Fact number 47. At the peak of the Kirkbride era in the 1880s, the superintendents of the great American asylums believed that they could cure nearly half of all admitted patients if the cases were treated early and kindly. They were, in fact, correct. Records from the Worcester State Hospital and the Utica State Hospital show discharge rates above 40% for patients admitted within 6 months of the onset of illness. But the system, funded by each state legislature, quickly grew beyond its capacity.
More patients were admitted than could be properly cared for. The wards, designed for 250, came to hold 500, then 1,000. The gardens filled with outbuildings. The 1 attendant per 20 patients ratio collapsed. The discharge rates fell. By 1900, fewer than a quarter of patients were recovering. The failure of the American asylum was not a failure of the original idea. It was a failure to keep the promise of the original idea, year after year, in the face of rising numbers and falling budgets. The beautiful buildings remained. The beautiful method quietly died inside them. Fact number 48.
As the American asylums filled past their capacity, conditions in the back wards began to resemble those that Dorothea Dix had fought to end. Patients again slept on straw in winter. Attendants again used restraints. Food again grew thin. The long corridors designed to be walked by small groups became crowded thoroughfares of silent, shuffling men and women in identical gray shirts. In 1895, one journalist at the Cook County Asylum in Illinois counted 1,800 patients in a building designed for 600. He saw one attendant supervising the sleep of an entire ward of 200 men. He saw patients who had not been washed in weeks. He saw, he wrote, the quiet return of the horrors his own grandmother had fought against.
Reform, we learn again and again, is not a monument. It is a habit. It must be renewed every generation, or the old darkness, which never truly leaves, creeps back into the empty rooms. Fact number 49. Dorothea Dix spent the last 6 years of her life as a resident, by invitation, in a small suite of rooms at the New Jersey State Hospital in Trenton, the first of the great public asylums she had helped to found. She was 80 years old when she arrived. She was frail, nearly blind, and could no longer travel. She had chosen to live among the people for whom she had fought. The patients came quietly to her door to speak with her. The nurses brought her tea in the afternoons.
She wrote letters, slowly with a careful hand, to old correspondents in Europe. She attended the Sunday services in the hospital chapel. When she died on the 17th of July, 1887, the patients of the hospital stood silent in the corridors as her coffin was carried out. She had begun her work by teaching a Sunday school class in a jail. She ended it living quietly, in the kind of hospital she had dreamed of building. A life shaped, from beginning to end, by the simple refusal to believe that the mad could not feel the cold. Fact number 50.
In the year of Dorothea Dix's death, 1887, there were more than 140 state and territorial asylums in the United States, holding more than 80,000 patients between them. Most of them had been founded or dramatically enlarged through her direct efforts. Many of them bore her name engraved on cornerstones and in dedication plaques. Most of those plaques have since been torn down or paved over or lost in the long, slow decay of the asylum era. And yet her achievement remains, not in stone, but in a simple principle that has passed into the foundational law of every developed nation. The mentally ill, the principle says, are the responsibility of the state and must be cared for in dignified conditions.
It is a principle we have honored unevenly, which is to say, as we honor nearly all our better principles. But it exists because she walked for 40 years through almshouses no one else would enter. Kindness, we think sometimes, is soft, but kindness, pressed into a habit by a determined woman with a small notebook, can shift the architecture of a nation. Hers did.
Fact number 51. The straitjacket, or camisole de force, was invented in 1790 by a French upholsterer named Bicêtre, at the suggestion of the physicians at the Bicêtre hospital. It was a canvas coat with long sleeves that were sewn shut at the ends. The sleeves were crossed over the patient's chest and tied behind the back. The coat was laced up the rear with heavy ribbon. It was at the time a significant humanitarian improvement over the iron chain. It allowed the patient to walk, to sit, to eat a spoonful of soup held to the lips by an attendant, while preventing the hands from striking, tearing, or causing self-harm. Pinel approved of it. So did the Quakers at York.
For most of the 19th century, the straitjacket was considered a tool of mercy. By the 20th century, however, its use had become routine, and its mercy had become a ritual. A patient might be placed in a straitjacket for days, sometimes weeks. The shoulders grew sore, the back cramped. The mind, deprived of the use of its own hands, began to feel itself a thing rather than a person. What had begun as an alternative to the chain became, over time, a softer kind of chain. Fact number 52. Among the stranger restraints of the 19th century was a device called the Utica crib, developed around 1845 at the Utica State Hospital in New York.
It was a wooden box.
A photograph from 1905 shows a long row of them in a ward at the Cleveland State Hospital, each one containing a sleeping or silent inmate. The history of restraint is the history of well-meaning designers persuading themselves that a new shape of cage is somehow not a cage. And yet, to the person inside, every cage is the same cage. It is the one you cannot open from within. Fact number 53. The rotary chair, also called the gyrating chair or the swing chair, was described in detail by Erasmus Darwin in the year 1796. The patient was seated in a chair suspended by ropes from the ceiling and strapped into place.
An attendant spun the chair around, sometimes at speeds of more than 100 rotations per minute. The patient grew dizzy, sick, and often unconscious. Darwin believed that the spinning produced a revolution in the mind parallel to the revolution of the body, breaking up the fixed patterns of melancholy and mania. He was wrong about the mechanism, but he was not entirely wrong about the outcome. A patient who had just been spun for 10 minutes was indeed quiet, docile, and often compliant.
We are still learning, slowly, to distinguish a cured person from a merely silenced one. Fact number 54. In 1781, the American physician Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, proposed a device he called the tranquilizer. It was a heavy wooden chair fitted with straps for the ankles, thighs, wrists, and chest, and a hollow wooden box that was fitted over the patient's head to block sight and sound. The box had holes for the nose to permit breathing. A patient was strapped into the tranquilizer and kept there, motionless, for hours or days at a time.
Rush believed that madness was caused by too much blood flowing to the brain, and that by holding a patient absolutely still, with the senses shut off, the circulation would slow and the brain would cool. He designed the chair personally, had it built by a Philadelphia carpenter, and installed several of them at the Pennsylvania hospital, where he was the senior physician. His name is on the $1 bill of the American Psychiatric Association's seal. He is called the father of American psychiatry, and yet he invented, in all sincerity, a chair that held the patient so still that nothing in the room could reach the mind at all. The father of American psychiatry built a box. Something about that image should be held in silence, not dismissed.
Fact number 55. Ankle muffs, wrist muffs, and mittens of padded leather were standard equipment in nearly every large asylum of the 19th century. The wrist muffs were buckled around the hands to prevent the patient from scratching or tearing, from picking at skin, from pulling at hair. The mittens were used to prevent a patient from using the fingers at all when, for instance, a wound needed to heal. These muffs were considered the gentle restraints, the restraints one applied to a mildly disturbed patient whom one did not wish to chain or strap down. In one sense, they were indeed gentler than the older tools. In another sense, they made the restraint constant, a kind of background condition of daily life.
A patient could walk around the ward, could speak, could eat soup brought to the mouth by an attendant, but she could not use her own hands. To lose the use of the hands for a day is a frustration. To lose them for a year is a different kind of loss. The hands are how we touch the world. A ward full of patients in padded mittens is a ward in which the world has become a little further away. Fact number 56. The bed strap was perhaps the most common restraint in hospital wards of the late 19th and early 20th century.
It was a wide canvas or leather belt fastened across the chest of a patient who had been placed in bed, looped around the bed frame and buckled beneath. The patient could turn his head, move his arms slightly, speak. He could not rise. He could not leave the bed. In some hospitals, patients were kept in bed straps for the purpose of feeding therapy, to ensure that they lay still after a heavy meal. In others, they were strapped at night to prevent them from wandering the corridors. In still others, patients spent entire days strapped to the bed, while attendants moved about the ward around them. There is an old saying that the bed is the final refuge.
When the bed itself is locked around the body, that refuge has become its own small prison. For many patients of the long asylum era, the bed was the last thing in the world to which they were ever tied, and they were tied to it until they did not rise again. Fact number 57. In the Bergolsli Clinic in Zurich, around the year 1900, the psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler attempted to abolish all mechanical restraints. He believed, following the non-restraint movement that had begun in Britain half a century earlier, that no patient should ever be physically bound, and that quiet attendance, open air, and regular work would do all that chains and straps had ever pretended to do. He was right, mostly.
His clinic was studied by visitors from all over Europe. The wards were calm. Patients walked in the gardens with their attendants. Violence was rare. A visiting American physician wrote in 1907 that he had never before seen a psychiatric hospital in which the mere atmosphere was itself a medicine. The lesson of Bleuler's clinic was that the restraint is very often an expression of the institution's fear, not the patient's danger. A fearful institution sees every patient as a potential threat. A confident institution sees the same patients as people in crisis. The tools brought to the ward follow, quite precisely, from which of these two visions the institution holds. Fact number 58.
In England, from the 1850s onward, a movement known as non-restraint was led by John Connolly, the chief physician of the Hanwell Asylum west of London. Connolly had taken over a hospital in which chains, muffs, and cribs were in constant use. On his first day, he ordered all restraints removed and forbade their future use. He then spent the next 15 years proving that a great hospital could be run without them. The results were dramatic. Violence did not increase. Deaths did not increase. The staff, forced to develop new methods of calming distressed patients, grew in skill and patience.
Connolly's method became the model for reform across Britain, and by the 1880s the English asylums were remarkably free of mechanical restraint, a distinction they held long after the American system had quietly begun to use straps again. One man, one hospital, one decision. Sometimes reform is the work of a generation. Sometimes it is the work of a single afternoon when a physician walks the wards and gives a new order. Connolly's afternoon is still with us. Fact number 59. In the American asylums of the early 20th century, a popular device was the continuous flow bath.
The patient was placed in a canvas hammock, suspended inside a bathtub. A canvas cover was drawn up over the tub to the neck, and warm water flowed continuously through the tub for hours at a time. The temperature was carefully regulated. The patient could not leave. The covering was secured by straps. Some patients enjoyed the bath. The warmth was soothing. The water masked the sounds of the ward. Others found it terrifying. A patient who could not lift her hands, could not see anything but the ceiling, could not climb out, might pass 10 hours in the tub and emerge utterly exhausted. The bath was at once a comfort and a cage, depending entirely on which patient and which day.
Every instrument of care in the history of the asylum has been, at one moment or another, also an instrument of control. The line between the two lies in the heart of the attendant, and in whether the patient, when she speaks, is heard. Fact number 60. By the middle of the 20th century, most physical restraints had been replaced in the wards of psychiatric hospitals by chemical restraints. The straitjacket gave way to the injection. The Utica crib gave way to the locked door. The swing chair gave way to the pill cup. This change was described in the medical literature as progress. In some ways it was. A patient who is quietly sleeping under a sedative is not the same as a patient strapped to a bed.
In another sense, the change was more subtle than progress. The body was no longer visibly bound. The binding had moved inside the bloodstream. A visitor walking a modern ward today does not see chains or straps. She sees calm, shuffling patients, quietly medicated into a new kind of stillness. A stillness often indistinguishable from the inside, from the stillness the chains once imposed. Every generation believes it has finally ended the restraint of the mad. Every generation discovers in time that it has only changed its shape. The long, quiet task remains: to hold, with open hands, those who cannot yet hold themselves.
Fact number 61. The continuous bath as practiced in American and European asylums from about 1890 through the 1940s was considered one of the great humane treatments of the age. A patient would be placed in a tub of warm water around 95 degrees Fahrenheit and kept there for 4, 6, 8, sometimes 24 hours. A canvas cover buckled over the top kept the heat in and the patient in place. Water flowed constantly through the tub to maintain the temperature. For many patients suffering from agitated mania, the bath was a genuine relief. The steady warmth calmed the nervous system. The darkness under the canvas dimmed the overbright world. Some patients slept for the first time in weeks.
For other patients, the bath was another kind of torment. A patient with claustrophobia, strapped beneath the canvas, could experience hours of rising panic. No one outside the tub could tell the difference by looking. That is the quiet problem of all such treatments. The same warm water is a womb to one soul and a prison to another. Fact number 62. The wet sheet pack or pack therapy involved wrapping a patient head to foot in cold wet sheets, then covering the wet sheets with dry blankets. The patient was then left strapped to a bed for several hours. As the body warmed the wet sheets, the patient began to sweat. The sheets grew hot.
A patient who began cold and shivering would end warm, damp, and nearly unable to move. The theory was that the treatment drew out toxins and calmed the nervous system through the countershock of heat following cold. The practice, for most patients, produced a deep, sometimes drugged, sleep. Some found it restful. Others found the slow warming of a sealed cocoon intolerable and remembered the pack therapy with horror for the rest of their lives. Whitman, visiting a New York asylum in 1873, wrote of seeing a long row of pack tables, each one bearing a bound patient, the attendants moving quietly among them like nurses in a Roman infirmary. He said it was the most ancient-looking medical ritual he had ever seen.
Fact number 63. The cold douche, or cold plunge, was the brutal older cousin of the continuous bath. The patient was stripped and forced to stand beneath a pipe that delivered a column of cold water, sometimes from a height of 6 feet, sometimes with the water at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The duration of the treatment was measured in seconds. In severe cases, it could be repeated 3 times in a single hour. The shock to the body was extreme. The patient gasped, screamed, collapsed. The blood pressure spiked and then fell. The theory was that the sudden cold would jolt the nervous system back into proper function.
In fact, it often produced a condition of profound exhaustion, so complete that the patient had to be carried back to the ward on a stretcher. The cold douche fell out of use by the 1920s in most American hospitals. In rural and state institutions, it lingered longer. A nurse who trained at a Texas state hospital in 1931 recalled that the douche was still used as late as that year, though by then it had become, in her words, a threat more often than a treatment. The pipe hung in a corner of the ward, unused most days, a silent warning to the patients of what would happen if they did not cooperate. Fact number 64.
The German physician Wilhelm Winternitz, in the late 19th century, established the principles of what he called scientific hydrotherapy. He believed that the precise application of water at controlled temperatures and durations could treat a wide range of mental disorders. His clinic in Vienna was a kind of grand hotel of water, with hundreds of taps, tubs, hoses, and rooms, each tuned to a specific temperature and specific purpose. Winternitz wrote long books full of diagrams. He measured pulse rates, breathing rates, skin temperatures. He insisted that hydrotherapy was not a folk remedy, but a precise medical science. In some cases, his methods helped patients. In many cases, they did not.
But his clinic was fashionable, wealthy, and well-lit, and for 30 years it was one of the most visited institutions in Central Europe. His real legacy, perhaps, was the idea of the spa as a place of healing. Long after the scientific claims of his hydrotherapy had faded, the quiet pleasures of warm baths and gentle walks in gardens remained, and remain today, a genuine comfort to tired minds. The science was mostly wrong. The kindness in the warm water was always right. Fact number 65. At many American asylums, bathing day was a weekly ritual. On one morning each week, all the patients of a ward were lined up in the bathing room and one by one, placed in the same large tub of soapy water.
An attendant scrubbed each patient with a long-handled brush. The same water served for 20, 30, 40 patients in sequence. In the ward at the Danvers State Hospital, a visiting inspector in 1902 described the water at the end of bathing day as thick, gray, and opaque. He noted that the last patient bathed was often the one who emerged least clean. The system was defended as efficient. It used a fraction of the hot water required for individual baths. Efficiency is a word that can hide almost anything. In a factory, it is a virtue. In a hospital, it can be a kind of slow insult, delivered in the gray water of the last patient in line. A bath is not only about cleanliness.
It is also about the message the water carries. For too long, asylum water carried the quiet message that each patient was worth a fraction of the next. Fact number 66. The great water cure spas of the 19th century at Baden-Baden, at Malvern, at Saratoga Springs, were not mental asylums in the strict sense, but they received a constant flow of patients who would today be diagnosed with depression, anxiety, or nervous exhaustion. Their physicians prescribed baths, walks, fresh milk, and quiet conversation. Many patients recovered. Many believed that they had been healed by the water itself. A certain Charles Darwin spent weeks at the Malvern water cure in 1849 after a long illness.
He bathed 3 times a day, walked in the hills, and took the slow meals prescribed. He wrote to his wife that he felt himself returning. He did not know whether the cause was the water, the walks, or the simple act of having nothing else to do. The secret of the spa was perhaps this: each patient was given, for a few weeks, the quiet gift of a life without demands. Whatever the water did, the silence did more. And the silence, if we are lucky, is still available to us today, in a warm bath, on a slow afternoon, far from the voices that usually require our answer. Fact number 67.
In France, the treatment known as the effusion involved a stream of cold water poured slowly onto the head of a seated patient from a height of several feet, through a brass nozzle, by an attendant standing on a small platform. The treatment lasted between 1 and 3 minutes. Its purpose was to shock the head, and by the head the mind, into a state of clarity. Many patients dreaded the effusion. Some were reported to have become incontinent, with fear at the sound of the attendant's footsteps on the platform. Others received the treatment quietly, as they had received so many other things.
A physician recorded that in his 30 years of practice, he had never been certain that the effusion had cured any patient, but that it had calmed many, in the ordinary way that any exhaustion calms. A calmed patient and a cured patient look very similar from across the room. It is one of the oldest confusions in the history of medicine, and one of the reasons that the history of medicine has taken so long to become medicine. Fact number 68. In the late 19th century, some American asylums installed elaborate hydrotherapy rooms with tiled walls, marble benches, and polished brass fixtures. The hospitals of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan each built such rooms as centerpieces of their therapeutic wings.
A visitor might be shown through them first, as a demonstration of the hospital's modernity. The photographs in medical journals of the period show them looking like the grand bathhouses of the Roman Empire. The patients who used these rooms often had mixed feelings. The grandeur of the architecture did not always match the grandeur of the experience. A cold douche delivered in a marble hall was still a cold douche. The brass fittings gleamed, the tiles sparkled, the body still shivered under the falling water. There is a long history of dressing medical cruelty in marble. The marble does not soften the cruelty, though it does comfort the institution that administers it.
We must look past the tiles, always, to what is actually happening to the body standing in the center of the room. Fact number 69. By the 1930s, Scientific hydrotherapy was in rapid decline across the Western world. The rise of new drug therapies and growing skepticism among physicians about the scientific basis of water cures made the old elaborate bathing regimens look outdated and even faintly absurd. The great tiled rooms were converted into storage or laundry or simply abandoned. Some of them survive today, deep inside old hospital buildings that have been repurposed into apartments, offices, or universities.
A student at the University of Arkansas, exploring the basement of an old dormitory that had once been part of the state hospital, discovered in 1993 a long tiled room lined with benches and marked with the faded words, Hydrotherapy 3. The taps and hoses were gone. The tiles remained, pale green, cold, quietly waiting. Every old building keeps such rooms. Rooms that were once loud with the hiss of water, rooms where earnest physicians believed that they were on the cusp of curing the human mind. The water is gone now. Only the tile remains, cool to the touch, patient with its small secret. Fact number 70. The philosophical legacy of the water cure era is not in the specific treatments, most of which are forgotten.
It is in a single idea that was correct even when the methods around it were wrong. The idea is that the body and the mind are not two separate things, and that one cannot heal without tending to the other. The water, whatever else it did, forced the 19th century physician to touch the body of the mentally ill patient. Before hydrotherapy, many physicians spoke with patients only from across a room, in a professional voice, for a few minutes a day. During hydrotherapy, attendants handled their patients constantly, measured their temperature, wrapped them in sheets, held their hands in warm tubs. The touch may not have been always gentle, but it was at least acknowledgement that a body lay inside the diagnosis. To touch the body of the suffering, gently, patiently, for hours at a time, is itself a kind of medicine. The water cure, for all its errors, remembered this. And sometimes, in the long corridor of our own nights, it is still the best medicine we have. A warm hand on a cold forehead, and the slow return of quiet. Fact number 71. In the year 1935, at an international neurology conference in London, 2 American physicians presented research on chimpanzees in which they had surgically separated the frontal lobes from the rest of the brain. The chimps, after the surgery, became placid, unable to become frustrated, and indifferent to the cages that had previously driven them to distraction. In the audience sat a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz. Moniz, then 61 years old, was an accomplished physician and a former Portuguese foreign minister. He had invented the technique of cerebral angiography. He was a man of great prestige and no great humility. He returned to Lisbon and within 4 months performed the first human lobotomy on a severely depressed woman from a Portuguese asylum.
He drilled 2 small holes in her skull and injected alcohol to destroy tissue in her frontal lobes. The patient, he reported, became calmer. Her depression, he claimed, was cured. He began performing the operation on other patients, publishing his results, and sending the papers to clinics across Europe and America. In 1949, he would be awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his discovery. The prize has never been rescinded. Fact number 72. In November 1936, an American neurologist named Walter Freeman, working at the George Washington University Hospital, performed the first American lobotomy on a 63-year-old woman named Alice Hammett, who suffered from agitated depression.
The operation, which he called a prefrontal leucotomy, was performed by his surgical partner James Watts. Alice Hammett, Freeman later reported, was calmer and less anxious after the surgery. She lived another 5 years, mostly in a state of reduced emotional response. Freeman was fascinated by the procedure and by his own early results. He was not a surgeon. He had no surgical training. He became, in the years that followed, one of the most prolific popularizers of psychosurgery in the world, and eventually the most prolific single practitioner of lobotomies in American history. He was a man of great energy and great conviction, and he believed, with a sincerity that is perhaps the saddest part of the story, that he was bringing mercy to the hopeless.
History has not agreed with his assessment, but for a while, for nearly 2 decades, a great part of American psychiatry did. Fact number 73. In 1945, Walter Freeman developed a simpler, faster version of the lobotomy, which he called the transorbital lobotomy. Instead of drilling holes in the skull, he inserted a slender steel instrument, shaped like an ice pick, through the eye socket, above the eyeball, and into the frontal lobe of the brain. A sharp tap with a small hammer drove the pick through the thin bone at the top of the socket. Then the pick was swept from side to side, severing the connections of the frontal lobes. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes.
It did not require a hospital operating room. It did not even require general anesthesia. Freeman used electroshock to briefly stun the patient, then performed the operation on a bed or on a stretcher or sometimes on a kitchen table in a patient's home. He called it an office procedure. He began performing it in a traveling van that he called the lobotomobile, driving from state hospital to state hospital across America. Between 1945 and 1967, Walter Freeman personally performed or supervised more than 3,500 lobotomies in 23 states. He charged $25 each. He kept careful records.
He saw himself as a benefactor of the overcrowded state hospitals, a lone crusader carrying hope through the back wards of America in a station wagon. Fact number 74. The results of Freeman's lobotomies, carefully examined by later historians and statisticians, were catastrophic. Of the 3,500 patients on whom he operated, approximately 15% died during or shortly after the surgery. Another 20 to 30% were left severely impaired, unable to speak, unable to dress themselves, unable to control basic bodily functions. Many of the remainder were indeed calmer than they had been before. Some could return to their homes and live quiet lives, though usually without the range of emotion, ambition, or personality they had once possessed.
Their families, in many cases, described them as a shadow of the person who had been. Calm, agreeable, somewhere else. It is a terrible arithmetic. To cure the agitation of madness by reducing the whole human being to a smaller, quieter version of itself. The question that haunts the record is whether any of the patients would have chosen, if they had been able to choose, the silence that was delivered to them through a small steel pick above the eye. Fact number 75. Among Walter Freeman's earliest transorbital patients was a 23-year-old woman named Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of the future President John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
She was described by her family as mildly cognitively impaired, perhaps moderately so, but warm, social, and capable of independent living with assistance. In her early 20s, she had begun to experience mood swings and periods of agitation. Her father, Joseph Kennedy, concerned about scandal in his politically ambitious family, authorized Freeman and Watts to perform a lobotomy on her in November 1941. She was awake during the procedure. She was asked to count, to sing a song, to recite the alphabet.
When her responses grew incoherent and then stopped, the surgeons ended the operation. Rosemary Kennedy was left unable to speak intelligibly, unable to walk without assistance, incontinent, and severely intellectually disabled.
She lived in an institution in Wisconsin for the remaining 64 years of her life. Her family rarely visited. She died in 2005 at the age of 86. Her sister Eunice, who became a reformer for people with disabilities, later said that Rosemary was the most important teacher any of them had ever had. But she had been taught, as it were, in silence. Fact number 76. In the United States alone, between the year 1936 and the year 1960, approximately 40,000 patients received lobotomies. In the United Kingdom, the number was about 17,000.
In the Soviet Union, where Stalin banned the procedure in 1950, the total was probably no more than a few hundred, though the numbers are uncertain. In Japan, more than 30,000 lobotomies were performed during the same period. Most of these operations were performed on patients without meaningful informed consent. Many were performed on women, who were slightly more than half of the recipients. Many were performed on the poor, the institutionalized, the patients who lacked families to advocate for them. A small number were performed on private patients at the request of the family for troubles that today would be considered routine. It is a vast number.
40,000 small, quiet kitchens. 40,000 small evenings where a family could not understand why the person who came home was not quite the person who had gone in. For 20 years, the West performed this operation on a population the size of a small city and called it progress. Fact number 77. In 1952, a French pharmaceutical company synthesized a new drug called chlorpromazine, marketed in America as Thorazine. The drug calmed severely psychotic patients within hours, with a reliability that astonished the first physicians who used it. The noise of the wards dropped. Patients who had been screaming for months grew quiet. Some who had not spoken coherently for years.
Thorazine did what the lobotomy had tried to do without the skull. It did not require a surgeon. It did not require a steel pick. It required only a small orange tablet. By 1956, the use of chlorpromazine had swept American and European hospitals, and the number of new lobotomies had begun to fall. By 1960, the procedure was effectively obsolete in most major hospitals. Walter Freeman, who continued to advocate for it, found fewer and fewer institutions willing to receive him. It is one of the strange mercies of medical history that a new mistake sometimes ends an older mistake. Thorazine was not, as we now know, a simple or harmless drug. It had its own long shadow.
But the little orange tablet saved many tens of thousands of skulls from the traveling ice pick of the mid-century. Small mercies, delivered in strange packages, still count. Fact number 78. Walter Freeman performed his last lobotomy in February 1967 on a housewife from California named Helen Mortensen, who had been a patient of his since the 1940s. She had been lobotomized twice before. During the third procedure, Freeman's pick pierced a blood vessel in her brain. She hemorrhaged. She died 3 days later in the hospital. After her death, the hospital revoked Freeman's surgical privileges. His colleagues, who had long been uneasy, finally had an official reason to act.
He spent the remaining years of his life traveling America in his station wagon, visiting former patients, gathering their stories into a large manuscript that he believed would prove the worth of his life's work. He died of cancer in 1972. The manuscript was never published. There is something almost Homeric in the picture. An old man, driving alone through the country, visiting the silent people he had made silent, collecting their quiet words into a book no one would ever read. We do not always see the edges of our own stories. Sometimes the long drive home is the only way we learn what we have done. Fact number 79.
In the 1990s, the Nobel Foundation was asked repeatedly to rescind the 1949 prize awarded to Igor Moniz. The foundation declined. Its position then as now is that the prize is awarded for work as it was understood at the time, and that later developments cannot unwrite the past. The prize for the discovery of prefrontal leucotomy still stands on the official Nobel list between the prize for cortisone and the prize for malaria research. Some members of the medical community have argued that the prize should be withdrawn as a signal that psychiatry does not excuse what was done.
Others have argued that to rescind it would be to pretend that we did not collectively honor the procedure in our own time, and that pretending is worse than remembering. The prize stands. It is a small, uncomfortable thing in the long room of our history, a reminder that the awards of any age, including ours, are given by people who do not yet know what their own century will later be ashamed of. Fact number 80. Today, forms of psychosurgery still exist, though they are rare and tightly regulated.
A small number of patients with severe treatment-resistant obsessive-compulsive disorder or certain intractable depressions undergo a procedure called cingulotomy, in which a very small region of the brain is ablated by focused radio waves or, more recently, by deep brain stimulation delivered through fine electrodes. These modern procedures are precise, reversible in some cases, and consensual. They are also the direct descendants of Moniz's alcohol injection and Freeman's ice pick, though the family resemblance is faint. The same impulse is present, that the suffering of the mind can be reached by a careful instrument into the flesh of the brain. We are no longer wrong in the way that Freeman was wrong. We may still be wrong in ways that a later century will name.
A humble psychiatry, perhaps, is the only psychiatry worth having. It knows that its instruments are crude, that its patients are infinitely delicate, and that its certainties, like the Nobel Prize of 1949, may one day appear very strange indeed.
Fact number 81. On the 11th of April, 1938, at the Clinic for Mental and Nervous Diseases of the University of Rome, an Italian psychiatrist named Ugo Cerletti performed the first human electroconvulsive therapy on a homeless patient who had been found speaking incoherently at the Rome railway station. The patient's name is recorded in the hospital files only as Enrico X. He was 39 years old and had not spoken an intelligible sentence in weeks. Cerletti and his colleague Lucio Bini, after months of experiments on dogs, applied 2 electrodes to the patient's temples and delivered a current of about 80 volts for a fraction of a second. The patient convulsed briefly, lost consciousness, and awoke confused.
The next day, they repeated the treatment at a higher voltage. The patient had a full convulsion, slept, and then, when he awoke, spoke clearly for the first time in months. "I have been very ill," he said quietly. "Please send word to my family." Cerletti wept when he heard it. He had expected, he wrote, a slow improvement over many treatments. He had not expected that a single moment of electricity
could open a door that had been closed for so long. Whether the door opened for good reasons or bad reasons, Serletti could not say, but it had opened. Fact number 82. In the early years of electroconvulsive therapy, the treatment was administered without anesthesia and without muscle relaxants.
The patient, held down by several attendants, experienced the full force of a grand mal seizure. The body arched, the jaw clenched hard enough to break teeth, despite a rubber bite guard. Bones were sometimes fractured, particularly in the long bones of the elderly. The patient did not feel the electricity itself because consciousness was lost instantly. But the moments before the shock, lying strapped to the table, watching the physicians apply the electrodes, were often described by surviving patients as the most frightening moments of their lives. And afterward, the long, slow return of consciousness through a fog of confusion, sometimes with no memory of the morning, or the week, or the year. The treatment worked. That was the difficult thing.
Severely depressed patients, some of whom had been on the edge of suicide for months, recovered. Catatonic patients began to eat again. The success rate, measured narrowly, was high. And yet the experience was so terrifying that patients often begged not to receive it, even though they might owe their lives to it. Medicine is full of such knots. Fact number 83. In the 1950s and 60s, the use of ECT in American hospitals expanded dramatically. At its peak, around 1959, more than 100,000 patients per year received electroshock in the United States alone.
In many state hospitals, the treatment was used not only for severe depression, but for schizophrenia, alcoholism, homosexuality, and, in a number of cases, for patients whose chief symptom was that they had been disruptive on the ward. The treatment had become a tool of control as much as a tool of cure. A patient who argued with an attendant might be placed on the ECT schedule the following morning. This abuse of the therapy was documented by the sociologist Irving Goffman in his book Asylums, published in 1961. The book helped turn public opinion against the practice, even when it was appropriately used. A tool is only as good as the hand that holds it. An instrument that could pull a man back from the cliff of suicide was, in other hands, used to quiet the voice of someone who had only asked for better soup. The same electrodes. Two completely different treatments. Fact number 84. A turning point in the public image of ECT came in 1975 with the release of the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, adapted from the novel by Ken Kesey. In the film, the rebellious patient Randall McMurphy is subjected to electroshock as a punishment for defying the head nurse. The scene is filmed without mercy. The body convulses.
Causey had worked as a night attendant at a veterans hospital in California in the early 1960s, and he had seen ECT used in ways he considered unjust. The film made this reality visible to millions of people who had never set foot in a psychiatric hospital. After its release, the number of ECT treatments in America fell sharply. Some hospitals banned the procedure altogether. For a generation, the words shock treatment carried a weight of horror that made even appropriate use of the therapy politically impossible. Many patients who might have been helped were not. A single film had reshaped an entire branch of medicine, and not only for the better.
Stories we learn again and again have consequences that outlive the intentions of the storyteller.
Fact number 85. In the 1980s and 1990s, electroconvulsive therapy returned slowly to the toolkit of modern psychiatry, but in a thoroughly transformed form. It is now administered under general anesthesia, with a short-acting muscle relaxant that prevents the body from convulsing visibly. The seizure is measured by electroencephalogram, not by the bending of the back. The current is precisely calibrated. The whole procedure takes less than 5 minutes. The patient, a half hour later, is drinking a cup of coffee. In this modern form, ECT is one of the safest and most effective treatments in all of psychiatry for severe treatment-resistant depression. Its risks are real but manageable. The most common side effect is short-term memory loss, which usually resolves within weeks.
The most serious risks, those of an uncontrolled seizure, have been effectively eliminated. And yet the shadow of the old era persists. Many patients who might benefit from ECT refuse it because of images they carry from films or from the memories of an older relative. The treatment
The antidepressant group showed a 30% remission rate. The difference was not marginal. It was dramatic. More recent studies, using more rigorous methods, have found a smaller but still significant difference. For a certain subset of patients, those in whom depression has become so deep that they can no longer eat or speak, ECT remains, at present, the most effective treatment available in medicine. Not because it is a cleaner instrument than a pill, but because it reaches, by some still mysterious path, a place the pills cannot quite find. This is a humbling fact. The most severe forms of human suffering sometimes yield, not to our most refined interventions, but to a very old, very blunt instrument, softened now by anesthesia and muscle relaxants, but still, in essence, an electric current gently passed through a sorrowing brain. Fact number 87. Ugo Cerletti, in the years after his discovery, became uncomfortable with what his method had become. He had intended it for severe catatonia and agitated depression. He had not intended it as a routine tool of ward management. Late in his life, he wrote that he wished he had never discovered the method because of what others had done with it. He died in Rome in 1963 at the age of 86.
A quiet, reserved man who had wept at the first successful treatment of Enrico X and who had been troubled for 30 years by the uses to which his work had been put. He was not a Moniz. He did not defend his discovery against its critics. He lived, rather, in a kind of rueful silence, writing careful papers that urged restraint. Not every inventor loves his invention. Some watch with slow horror as the small thing they placed in the world grows wings they did not design and flies into rooms they never imagined. Cerletti was one of those. The rueful quiet at the end of his life is,
perhaps a more honest kind of expertise than the certainties of his earlier papers. Fact number 88.
In the late 20th century, a new variant of ECT was developed called bilateral brief pulse therapy, in which the electric current is delivered as a very short pulse rather than as a continuous wave. This reduces the intensity of memory loss while preserving the therapeutic effect. Further refinements have led to treatments in which the current is delivered only on one side of the head, in some cases reducing cognitive effects to nearly none. These refinements are undramatic. They do not make headlines. They do not appear in films. They are the quiet work of thousands of researchers, patients, and clinicians over decades, each one trimming a small corner of risk away from the older procedure. This is how medicine actually progresses.
Not in great leaps, but in small adjustments made by humble people over many slow years. The current that runs through the patient's temple today is no more mysterious than the current that ran through Enrico X in 1938. But the envelope around it, the anesthesia, the muscle relaxant, the brief pulse, the careful monitoring, is a product of long patient work. Progress, when it comes, is nearly always this shape: quiet, unnoticed, essential. Fact number 89. Some patients who have received modern ECT describe the experience in terms that are themselves almost philosophical.
One woman, a writer from London, wrote in 2012 that after her treatment she awoke with the sense that a very heavy curtain had been drawn back from a window in her mind, and that for the first time in 18 months she could see the garden outside. She did not remember the morning of the treatment. She did not remember, for several weeks afterward, the name of her favorite childhood pet. But she could see the garden. She could feel, again, the desire to walk among the roses. She said, in the article, that she would accept the loss of the name of the pet if she could keep the garden. This is the strange arithmetic of the treatment.
It takes something from you in order to give something back. For some patients, the trade is bitter. For others, it is the gift of being able to look out the window again. There is no formula for which patient will feel which way. There is only the long, careful conversation that should precede every treatment, and often does not. Fact number 90. The story of electroshock, taken as a whole, is a small version of the story of all of modern medicine. It begins with a discovery made in fear and ignorance. It grows into a tool used unjustly by people who meant well and by people who did not. It produces images, both real and fictional, that darken its name for a generation.
It is slowly refined, quietly, by people whose names are not remembered. It emerges in the end as a useful, imperfect, modest thing, whose right use must be chosen carefully every time. We will meet this pattern again. We will meet it with new drugs, with new forms of therapy, with new devices that we have not yet invented. Each of them will begin with excess, pass through scandal, and end, if we are patient, as a modest good in a modest toolkit. The task is not to find a perfect instrument. The task is to use our imperfect ones with growing kindness, generation by generation.
A current of electricity passed through a brain has a strange resemblance to the candle a monk might light at the bedside of a sleeping patient in the 12th century. Both are small blessings. Both are imperfect. Both are, at least, an attempt. And attempt offered in humility is the most that any age of medicine can honestly claim.
Fact number 91. On the 22nd of September, 1887, A young American newspaper reporter named Nellie Bly, aged 23, feigned symptoms of insanity at a boarding house in Lower Manhattan and was committed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island in the East River. She had been assigned by the editor of the New York World to report on conditions inside. She spent 10 days there. She was later smuggled out by the newspaper's lawyer. Her report, published in 6 installments in October of that year, described the asylum's food as a cold piece of bread, so stale it could not be chewed. It described ice baths in which the patients were scrubbed with the same water, one after another.
It described attendants who slapped, mocked, and beat the inmates. It described women held against their will for conditions that were not insanity but only poverty or a language other than English. The city responded within weeks. A grand jury inspected the asylum. Reforms were announced. Nellie Bly became, at 23 years old, the most famous journalist in New York. But more than that, she had set a precedent. The private cruelties of institutions, which had been hidden from public view for centuries, could with a certain courage and a certain disguise be brought into the sunlight. Fact number 92. The book 10 Days in a Madhouse, which collected Nellie Bly's asylum reports, sold out 3 printings within a month. It was read aloud in parlors.
It was debated in pulpits. A generation of young reformers, women and men, took up her example. By the turn of the 20th century, a wave of undercover journalism and patient testimonies had begun to document the inside of the asylum from the perspective of those held within. In 1908, a former patient named Clifford Beers published a book called A Mind That Found Itself, describing 3 years he had spent in 3 different Connecticut asylums. He had been beaten, isolated, strapped to a bed, and forgotten for weeks. His book, written in clear, measured prose, helped launch the American mental hygiene movement, which grew into the modern National Committee for Mental Health.
The voices of former patients have always been the most powerful correctives to the errors of the asylum. They come from the only people who truly know what the inside is like. Every era that has listened to those voices has improved. Every era that has dismissed them has repeated the errors of the previous century. Fact number 93. In 1952, as noted earlier, the French firm Rhone Poulenc brought to market the drug chlorpromazine, sold in America under the name Thorazine. Within 4 years of its introduction, the number of patients housed in American state hospitals began, for the first time in 100 years, to decline. By 1956, the total asylum population of the United States had fallen by 5,000.
By 1960, it had fallen by 50,000. The drug allowed many patients who had lived in the back wards for decades to become calm enough to be released into community care. At first, this seemed entirely a blessing. A generation of patients who had been written off as incurable were able to walk out of institutions they had entered as young adults and return, in some form, to the world outside. The trouble was that the world outside was not ready for them. Community care, the phrase on which the entire policy rested, existed mostly as a hope.
In actual practice, the community was often a single rented room, without food assistance, without follow-up, without any human voice to check on the patient from 1 week to the next. And the slow, difficult second chapter of deinstitutionalization began. Fact number 94. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963, signed by President John F. Kennedy shortly before his death, called for the creation of a network of federally funded community mental health centers across the United States to provide outpatient care for the patients whom the state hospitals would release.
The funding, which had been generous at first, was repeatedly cut by subsequent administrations. The patients, released from the closing hospitals in increasing numbers, found that the clinics which were supposed to serve them were often underfunded, overcrowded, or simply non-existent. A great reform was announced in 1963. A partial reform was funded through the 1970s. By the 1980s, the full reform had been quietly abandoned. The patients, however, had already been released. They remained in the world as the hospitals had closed behind them, and no clinics rose in time to catch the fall. Fact number 95.
In 1972, a television reporter named Geraldo Rivera, then 29 years old, carried a hidden camera into the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, a large institution for children and adults with intellectual disabilities. His footage, broadcast on New York television, showed naked patients lying on bare tile floors, covered in their own waste, in rooms that had been cleaned only days in advance for a scheduled inspection. Willowbrook, which had been designed for 4,000 residents, was then holding 6,000. Its staff was inadequate. Its food was thin. Its rooms were cold. The images of the children of Willowbrook were so severe that many viewers turned away from the television during the broadcast. Senator Robert Kennedy had called it a snake pit 4 years earlier.
Rivera's film showed that the pit had only deepened. The broadcast led to a federal lawsuit, a consent decree, the closing of Willowbrook in 1987, and the establishment of new community-based care for its former residents. It also helped, more broadly, to speed the closing of many other large institutions across the country. A camera carried past a door had once again changed the architecture of a nation. Fact number 96. During the 1980s, under the administration of President Ronald Reagan, federal funding for community mental health centers was further cut, and responsibility for mental health care was largely returned to the states. Many states, facing tight budgets of their own, simply closed their state hospitals without opening adequate replacements.
The number of state hospital beds in the United States fell from about 500,000 in 1955 to fewer than 60,000 by the year 2000. The hundreds of thousands of patients who had once lived in those hospitals did not, by and large, disappear. Some returned to families. Many could not. Some found places in smaller group homes. Some did not. A very significant portion, in the years that followed, became homeless or were arrested for minor offenses and sent to jails and prisons, which became, by default, the new asylums of America.
Today, the 3 largest mental health care institutions in the United States are, in order, the Los Angeles County Jail, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and the Rikers Island Prison Complex in New York. Each of these facilities houses more severely mentally ill people than any remaining state hospital. The long arc of deinstitutionalization has, in effect, replaced one set of institutions with another. Fact number 97. The image of the great state hospital, after the closures of the 1980s and 1990s, is today most often the image of a ruin.
Trenton State Hospital, Central State Hospital in Indiana, Cleveland State Hospital, Athens Asylum in Ohio, Danvers Hospital in Massachusetts. Each stands or once stood partially empty, with trees growing through the roofs, with paint peeling from the walls, with the names of former wards still painted faintly above the doors. Photographers and urban explorers in the years since have documented these ruins in meticulous detail,
Long corridors of empty beds, rooms full of abandoned charts, chapels with broken stained glass, iron tubs half filled with water left over from a last hydrotherapy session 30 years before. The ruins are beautiful and terrible at once. They feel, to many visitors, like the ruins of an older civilization. In a sense they are. The civilization of the Great Asylum is over.
It lasted roughly from the opening of the York Retreat in 1796 to the closure of the last of the large state hospitals around 1990. 2 centuries. A brief civilization. It produced buildings that will stand as shells for centuries more, long after the names on the iron gates have rusted away. Fact number 98. Among the unexpected legacies of the asylum era is the survival of its enormous archives. Many state hospitals kept careful records for more than 100 years, recording each patient's name, age, symptoms, diagnosis, treatments, and fate. Millions of casebooks still survive, in basements, in warehouses, in the storage of historical societies. They are the most complete record of mental suffering in the Western world.
Historians have only begun in the last generation to read them with care. They have found in them, beneath the diagnoses of the age, the faint outlines of real human lives. A young man who loved music, a woman who missed her sister, a boy who could not understand why his parents had stopped visiting. Each of them reduced in the record to a line or two of clinical shorthand, but each of them on closer reading, a whole story. These archives are difficult to use, ethically and practically. They involve the private sorrows of people who never consented to be read by strangers. They must be opened carefully, with respect. But they are also the only remaining voice of many lives that have been otherwise entirely forgotten.
To read them, slowly, with attention, is a small act of keeping company with the dead. Fact number 99. Modern psychiatric care in most wealthy nations today has moved almost entirely out of the great institutions and into outpatient clinics, short-stay hospital wards, group homes, and the offices of private therapists. A patient in distress today might spend a week in a hospital rather than a lifetime. Much of this change has been for the better. Much of it has been accompanied, however, by the quiet worsening of homelessness and incarceration for those whom the new system has failed to reach. We have not, as a civilization, solved the problem of mental illness. We have only rearranged the architecture around it.
Where once there were great buildings on hills, now there are small rooms in city buildings, streets where people sleep in blankets, and jails filled with men and women whose chief crime, in the eyes of history, was to be born into minds that needed more help than any century has yet known how to give. The long work continues. It will continue into centuries that we will not see. The names of the places will change. The forms of the treatment will change. The simple fact that every town still contains a certain number of people who need more love and more care than the town knows how to give, that fact will not change. It is our inheritance, handed to us by the asylums we have closed.
We are still deciding what to do with it. Fact number 100. In the chapel of the old Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio, closed in 1993, there is an inscription that was carved into a wooden beam by an unknown patient in the year 1894. It reads, "In a careful hand, this place is not the end of the world. The beam now hangs in a small museum in the basement of the main building, visited occasionally by students from the nearby university. We do not know who carved the words. We do not know whether they were meant as a comfort to the carver, or to some future reader, or to no one at all."
We know only that for one evening in 1894, a person in that chapel who had perhaps been placed there against his will, took a knife and decided to leave a small message in the grain of the wood. This place is not the end of the world. This has been the long story of the insane asylums of history, their grand beginnings, their cruel middles, their quiet endings, the many names we have given to suffering, and the many instruments we have invented, in hope or in error, to ease it.
The chains and the ice, the swinging chairs and the ice picks, the quiet reformers and the loud abusers, and behind all of it, the long, patient murmur of the human mind trying to come home to itself. May any mind listening now find its own gentle way home, this night and every night. Sleep softly. The walls are only wood. The door is not locked. This place is not the end of the world. Total. 2,050 words, 100 facts.